Good morning. So shall we begin? On behalf of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute and the CUNY School of Public Health, a heartfelt welcome for everyone during these difficult times. Thank you to everyone participating in this forum, the members of the audience and our speakers. We wish you and your families and friends all the best of health, both physical and emotional, over the coming weeks and months. This is a difficult time, and we're grateful that you're able to join us virtually in this forum. My name is Nevin Cohen. I'm a faculty member here at the School of Public Health, and I'm the research director at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. One of the things that we do every month is hold a forum on an issue that's of particular importance and relevance to the community of folks who are interested and working on urban food policy issues. I want to recognize Rosita Ilieva, who I think you will eventually be able to see on the screen, the Director of Food Policy Monitor at the Institute, my colleagues Craig Willingham, Nick Freudenberg, and other Institute staff. And I want to thank the New York Community Trust for its support of our regional planning efforts, which are beginning, and we'll talk about those during this forum. This is our first virtual forum, so it's a bit of an experiment for us. We plan to have our April forum on regional food issues as well, drilling down to some of the topics covered today. Given the uncertainties around the epidemic and the university schedule, we will reach out to all of you with the date and time and format of our April forum very soon, and hope in advance that you'll be able to participate. I'll be the moderator of today's forum. I'd just like to mention a few logistics, then make some introductory remarks about today's topic, and I'll be introducing and turning over the discussion to our panel of speakers in the order that they are listed in the forum invitation. Each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes, and we hope to have time for discussion. For those of you who are participating from a computer, please feel free to send us questions or comments using the chat feature that you'll find as an icon, I think, at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be asking the audience a few questions during the forum using Zoom's polling feature, and the answers are anonymous, and we're not using the responses for anything other than to get some feedback for today's session. For example, we'd like to get a sense of your backgrounds, what sectors you work in. So I wonder if we could actually have the first poll and see what the responses are. So which type of organizations are you affiliated with? If you could select all the organizations that apply to you. Give people just a minute. Great, do we have polling results? Are we still getting responses, Rosita? And you are on mute, Rosita, so we can't hear you.
Yes, we do have the results in. We have 40% of our participants are from nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations, another 36% from academia. Then we have 13% from government and 9% from private businesses, and around 20% shared there from another type of organization.
Excellent. So we have a nice mix of people in the audience, and we do look forward to your contribution of comments and questions as well. And we'll try to capture all of the comments that you post in the chat board and find a way to reshare them with members of the audience. So I'd like to just take a few moments to say a few things about why the process of regional food planning is so important, especially during this moment of crisis in light of the COVID-19 epidemic. I'll just mention a few key reasons. The first, I think, is that planning is really critical before a crisis hits, but often occurs after a crisis occurs as a response to crisis. And in thinking about that, I remembered and reflected back 100 years ago, in fact, in October 1921 to be precise. There was a different sort of crisis that loomed in the country that prompted us in the region to begin planning our regional food system. It was a planned nationwide railroad strike that threatened to shut down the transportation system in this country, disrupting commerce across the nation. And it made real the possibility that the nation's largest city, dependent on distant food supplies and losing nearby farmland to suburbanization, would be at risk if those supplies were cut off. And it prompted the chief of the Commerce Bureau of the Port Authority of New York, Walter Hedden, to write what is the first comprehensive regional plan for the city's food supply. And his book, How Great Cities Are Fed, was published in 1929. It was really the first study of the food chain. He actually coined the term, and he described it as the geographic area from which food flows into a community, including the rural and urban farmland, processing and distribution facilities, transportation systems, and wholesalers and retailers that make up a region's food system. And I'm happy to share with you a link to the document if people are interested. But here we are a century later, and another crisis makes clear the vulnerabilities, not only in our food system, but of the many systems on which everyday life and commerce relies, calling into questions assumptions about our reliance solely on market-based decisions about essentials like personal protective equipment in hospitals, to food transportation, distribution, and retail infrastructure. The Institute asked a question in part of a survey that the School of Public Health is administering weekly during the COVID-19 epidemic. We asked the question about food access among a representative sample of New Yorkers, and we found that half of the respondents reported that their ability to get the food that they needed had been reduced a lot or somewhat, which showed the rapid change in food availability in the first few weeks of the pandemic. And what we noticed too is that lower income households reported more of a disruption than more affluent households. And households that were Latinx, Asian, Black, and multiracial reported higher levels of significant reductions in food availability compared to white households. And that's just one data point, but it really reflects the need for us to begin to do proactive planning, especially in light of impending crises that will occur as a result of climate change in this region. The second point I want to make is that we need to develop the governance systems to enable us to plan regionally. The US doesn't do regional planning well. Other countries, from the Netherlands to France, have structures in place to do regional planning. We do planning poorly. With the exception of places like Portland, cities don't have well-developed regional planning agencies. Often regional planning happens through the initiative of regional transportation or economic development agencies. And sometimes it works well in places like the Delaware Valley and the Philadelphia region, but often those planning entities lack the financial or legal mechanisms to operationalize the goals of regional food planning. In the New York metro area, we have public authorities like the Port Authority, water authorities like New York's DEP, and even trans-jurisdictional entities seemingly unrelated to food that potentially have a large impact on the food system. The New York State Thruway Authority, where trucks travel, or the Pine Barrens Commission on Long Island, which governs a large chunk of land in Long Island, that can be enrolled in regional food planning. So my second point is that plans must be able to put into practice the goals that emerge through the planning process, and doing so requires thinking about which entities have the capacities to make needed infrastructure investments, change zoning, regulate or incentivize industries and empower currently disengaged stakeholders. My third and last point is that social justice and equity need to be integrated into regional planning. Issues of racial, gender, and class oppression, if they're considered at all in regional planning, tend to be treated as almost ancillary to the planning processes instead of being part of the methods used for planning. So for example, food access might be measured as geographic access to food retail, but not necessarily as a function of wealth inequality. Farmland preservation might be tracked in terms of the need for farm transition planning for aging farmers. Clearly an important objective if we want to maintain food production in the region, but not in terms of reversing historic processes of dispossession of people of color from the land, and certainly not in terms of the goal of food sovereignty. And so what we need to think about as we develop regional food plans and policies are the underlying theories, assumptions, and methods, analytical methods that go into our analyses. What goes into our cost-benefit analyses? What discount rate do we use and why? How much do we value resilience, which may require redundancies in infrastructure over efficiency? How much do we focus on financial risk, which can be mitigated through insurance, versus production and distribution risks, which might need to be mitigated through physical infrastructure like backup generators for supermarkets in neighborhoods prone to flooding? So the answers to these questions have significant equity implications, so putting them front and center is the way to incorporate equity in regional planning from the start. So I hope that gives some context to the things that the Institute is thinking about as we begin a project that involves bringing together stakeholders like yourselves in a dialogue about regional food planning for the metropolitan area. And I hope that it sets the stage for some of the discussion we have today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kolo Zigby, who's a long-term colleague of mine and is now an independent consultant based in New York, who offers a range of services to local governments, nonprofits, foundations, and impact investors engaged in transitioning to more socially equitable and environmentally sustainable systems. And she's had a long career of work over 2 decades in the philanthropic sector, supporting community-based projects, programs, and organizations that have advanced social justice, environmental justice, agroecology, family farming, community-controlled food systems, food justice, and food sovereignty. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kolo. Thanks.
Thank you, Nevin. Thanks for putting together this presentation. It's so important, I think, especially now when I think there's a shared feeling that having systems that operate primarily based on market metrics of profit and profitability is not securing our welfare in times of crisis. And there's a sense, a growing sense, that those who are least served by a system and most vulnerable present vulnerabilities for everyone. I think we have that awareness now that this idea of justice is not just because we want to be good people, but it's actually because we're all interdependent. And those who are insecure, who don't have health care, et cetera, not only have increased risks for themselves, but then increase the risk for everyone. So I think that does have implications for how we think about systems change and how to build more resilient systems, and what equity means in those resilient systems, more resilient systems. And to understand what an equitable regional food system looks like, I'm sort of playing with the order of words here: regional food equity versus equitable regional food system. I think it's important. I just want to raise up that, let's all urge everyone to take time to understand what structural racism is, how it's operated in the United States. There's a lot of information out there. I'm not going to go into detail about the history of structural racism in the food system, but there is a terrific resource by Michigan State University, has an annotated bibliography with almost 300 citations, videos, academic papers, journal articles, etc., all related to the topic of structural racism in the food system. And you know, that's a really critical for everybody to inform, you know, for us all to inform ourselves about what that looks like. And I think a key consideration for planners is that the default ways that we address creating strategies for the allocation of resources for what needs to happen that tend to be race neutral, basically don't generally, I think in general, don't get us towards greater equity. And that we need to be really conscientious about having parallel processes that do. Can I have the first slide, please? So I want to give some gratitude to Steve Rosenberg from Scenic Hudson Land Trust, because he has allowed me to share these slides from the food shed conservation plan that they created for the Hudson Valley region, which I think is a really important plan. And now I'm going to sort of use the lens of, in terms of the food system, of food production, right? Who is producing food in our region? And of course, the Hudson Valley doesn't represent the entire tri-state region. It's not, I'm not saying this is the food shed, but this is a plan that was done addressing this particular, let's say, sub-region within the New York City food shed. And it's a very interesting plan because, number one, the data revealed that there isn't very good data about the farms that exist within our food shed. The methodology was, you know, pretty interesting in trying to collect this data. And I want to just raise up that there's very little data available about people of color farmers in the Hudson Valley or in our region in general. And what we do know from the State Department of Agriculture is that there's something like around 150 people of color and Black farmers in New York City. This particular plan looked at farms over 45 acres, and in trying to strategize and think of a way to prioritize support for conservation, for the preservation of land, they're looking at, you know, what should we prioritize? So farms of a substantial size and farms with good soil quality as well as farms that have that are clustered together. Next slide, please. So what does that do? As we know, farmers of color generally have been operating on more marginal lands because of barriers to purchasing the land around cost and lack of credit and financing. We know that, for example, Black Americans, the net worth of Black people in the United States is significantly less, you know, $9,000 or $8,000 compared to over $130,000 for the average white family. So not only is it more marginal lands, but tend to be smaller farms. So people of color farmers, Black farmers, are probably not represented in this plan. And so when we, and this pie chart was also taken from the plan, and of course the plan is focused on securing the land base, but recognizes that there's all these other aspects. And I would say that this question of leveling the playing field for farmers, there's a different metric that would have to be, a different process that would have to be used for leveling the playing field for people of color farmers. So there's almost a need for a separate parallel, plan to be created to include people of color farmers, that would have to be overlaid into a planning process. It's not to say that this plan is not good, it's just not sufficient. And I think Steve would be the first person to recognize that in and of itself, it's not sufficient to reach the equity goals. Next slide, please. And so how do we do that? There is a growing ecosystem of groups that are working together, and the ones, I took some logos of some groups that I'm aware of and that I work with. There are other organizations. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but there are groups that are addressing the variety of functions that are needed to support the success and inclusion of more people of color as farmers in New York State. And that's everything from training new farmers and providing technical assistance, providing culturally relevant networks and advocacy, and also coming up with financing mechanisms for low-cost credit and equity, that where the decision-making processes are more community-based. And so very important to recognize that, and these organizations are led by people of color. So this is not something that can be addressed without the inclusion of people of color led organizations that are already doing the work. So in terms of who should be sitting at the table, there are organizations that have begun the planning process that should certainly be included, and can help us get to a more equitable regional food system. And I'll just leave it at that example.
Thank you so much, Kolo. I look forward to further discussion at the end of the talks. Our next speaker is Kate Clancy, a colleague of mine for many years and food systems consultant and visiting scholar at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins. She's also an adjunct professor at Tufts, visiting teaching professor at Syracuse University, and a senior fellow at the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota. Kate has been involved in teaching about and researching regional food systems. She edited a volume on agriculture of the middle, a fascinating book about a really important issue in our food systems. And she was the deputy director of the USD-funded 7-year study of food systems in the Northeast US. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kate. Kate, your mic is muted.
Rosie, okay. Is that okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, was waiting for Rosita, I think. So thanks so much for the introduction, Nevin, and for the chance to be with you today. My comments are mainly going to address the tri-state or regional focus of the Food Equity Plan. And I'll start with the concept of regionalism, which many experts believe is a useful framework for addressing complicated border-transcending problems such as regional economies, uncoordinated land use policies, environmental challenges including climate change, public health epidemics, and food systems and food security issues. Kathy Roof and I wrote a paper on this topic 10 years ago, and we're in the process of updating and expanding that shorter paper into a report that will be available sometime this summer. The regional food systems is not a new concept for the New York City region, as obviously Nevin has already pointed out. Among many examples is a report called FoodWorks that was produced in 2010 for the New York City Council by a large group of experts, including Nevin. In the report, regional food systems are the focus, although they are not defined in the report. In most instances, regional appears to apply to the boundaries of New York State, but there is a recommendation that the state be asked to enact legislation that would allow the city to preference the purchases of food produced in other states in the region. Regions have fluid boundaries, and they can be defined in a variety of ways. What's critical is that a region is always larger than what might be labeled as local and cannot be understood or operationalized if regional and local are conflated. And that point I could make over and over again in my remarks this morning. In the Northeast particularly, it's important to recognize that regions overlap as large urban areas grow and extend their reach. This is shown very clearly on the map that Rosita is going to show you right now. A map that was done by the Urban Design Lab at Columbia University about 10 years ago. And Rosita, you could leave this up as I go through my remarks. Thank you. Because food is dependent on the natural capital and resource base of any particular region, food systems are characterized by the geographic fixity of farmland, by regional climate conditions, and natural resources such as water and land. Structures and conditions across supply chain components give a region some of its comparative advantages and challenges. And it's very important to clarify the distinction, again, between local and regional, because not doing so makes it very difficult to assess the self-reliance that can be reached with regard to food supplies. So there are many attributes of regional food systems that Kathy and I have been chronicling in the report. Included in the list are 6 of the following. Systems are not just about geography. They are about scale, markets, values, equity, choice, control, and stewardship. Regional food systems produce the volume and variety of foods to meet as many of the dietary needs and preferences of the population as possible within the region's resource capacity. That's an underline. The latter is critical because it recognizes the importance of environmental sustainability and many other elements of sustainability. Regional systems emphasize products differentiated by quality, place, or other attributes. Regionally focused food systems may provide opportunities to mitigate equity disparities for stakeholders along the entire food chain. Regional supply chains offer more access to markets for mid-sized producers and processors who cannot compete globally. And smaller producers can take advantage of larger regional food hubs, which are increasingly critical option as direct markets in the region and across the country plateau, and in some areas decline. This in turn can provide more product volume and choice to consumers of all income levels. Regional approaches to land use and access and training of farmers of color, immigrant farmers, and other underserved disadvantaged producer groups can be both efficient and responsive to the needs and conditions of those audience in a particular region, as Kolu has just been speaking about. And we also have the example of the Northeast farmers of color who are located in New England and upstate New York that is training and advocating for this particular set of farmers. Finally, regional equity in federal policy means that no regions are treated unfairly in the allocation of programs and funding from USDA, from EPA, from the Department of Transportation, from many kinds of programs. In practice, it turns out that we now know that the regional equity provisions in federal farm bills have distributed a significant amount of conservation dollars to Northeast producers, but people had to fight for those dollars against other regions in the country. Larger scale supply chains have attributes of both commodity and alternative systems, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, but it's true. The food demand for the Northeast region is very, very large. That's an understatement. And so these supply chains at this point include many hybrids. That is, they contain alternative and conventional segments. For example, a lot of the transportation segments of regional supply chains are conventional transportation networks and companies. Finally, all scales are needed to implement food systems solutions. Regional efforts connect with local, national, and global levels, including trade options. And regions are the bedrock of rural-urban connections as embodied in new city regions or metropolitan food sheds around the world. And Nevin touched on this earlier. So resilience and diversity are the underpinnings of regional food systems. We commonly think of resilience as the ability of the system to withstand shocks while maintaining its basic structure and functions. But it's also the capacity to learn, to combine experience and knowledge, and adjust responses to changing external drivers and internal processes in order to continue operating. Resilience can be arrived at by many pathways, and I'm just going to mention a set of them that we think applied in the Northeast. The first is we have to maintain all possible farmland in the region, along with new farmers, in a coordinated way, and not just left up to individual counties. We have to rethink what food access for low-income populations means at all scales, from local to global, recognizing that if you don't engage all the scales, you do not have a resilient system, and food is going to continue to come from many different scales into the at least intermediate future. We need to source from multiple scales of distribution and diverse markets. The Northeast, which we've been studying now for many years, extends from Maine to West Virginia, a distance of 1,200 miles, which contains 7 of the 8 US growing zones. This is very important as we consider how to develop more resilience, biodiversity, and food security. We need to bring innovations and resources to present supply chains. We need to diversify present distribution networks and build new supply chain components where necessary, particularly with regard to distribution and processing. We need to strengthen old or build new regional institutions that enhance logistics and pay a lot of attention to governance structures. We need to research and identify multiple ways to adapt to climate change and mitigate its effects. Developing and implementing regional food plans is a daunting task, offering a number of constraints and challenges. Let me just mention a couple of them. These start with a general overall lack of familiarity about how regions operate, and this lack of familiarity extends from politicians through consumers and many other food system actors. Politics and political boundaries keep many needed programs and policies from being adopted and implemented across counties and states. The dominant food system, which many people don't remember was well organized at a regional level some decades ago, has pretty much disappeared into a national and global system. So at this point, there are multiple infrastructure needs in the Northeast, from road repairs to processing plants to, again, new governance structures. So what can be done to promote regional food systems? Just throw out a few things here for discussion later and for your thoughts. Use language that promotes regional, not just local. And we're talking about branding campaigns that focus more on regional. We have very few of these right now, except for those products which are very specific to a region, like crabs in the Chesapeake Bay. Another thing that can be done is that since regions are expressed via structures, agreements, programs and policies and other means, we need to look for political mechanisms that allow and foster cross-state cooperation and action. There are many examples of regional institutes and institutions. The Northeast Association of State Departments of Agriculture, the Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group, which has had a strong emphasis over the last several years on social justice, structural racism, and equity concerns. COGS, regional planning associations, and government organizations. There is such a thing as the Northeast Climate Hub. There is such a thing as a collaboration to look at across the Northeast at transportation and global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's lots of precedents and work that's been done at a regional level to learn from. Groups need to assess land use, availability, and protection from a regional perspective, not from just a county perspective, as is the case now. Need to engage civic and nonprofit groups that already cross state lines. Need to mitigate barriers to regional commerce, and there are more than those than you can imagine. We need to encourage and make use of tri-state entities, both public and private. We need to consider what the appropriate scale is for different dimensions of regional food security, such as social justice, and all the things that Kolo has been talking about. The scale for approaching some of those issues may be best at the local level, and at the scale for other things may be best at a regional level, and the scale for other programs and policies may be at a national level. And let me finish my comments up by telling everybody that maybe we need to keep in mind what Laura Lennox said a couple of years ago. Laura is an expert on resiliency. She lives in Southwest Virginia and is doing wonderful work around the issues of resiliency. She said, regional is the scale you need to provide all the qualities of a resilient system to create the diversity you need, and a large enough scale to create the wealthy asset base that systems need to be resilient. So thanks, and I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Kate. That was terrific. And I'd like to now turn to Matt Weskowitz, who's a regional planner for the New York City Department of City Planning, focusing on exactly what we're talking about, identifying, analyzing long-term trends that support equitable and sustainable growth of the city and its connection to the region. And he has a degree in regional development from Cardiff University, and a department at Cardiff that has focused quite a bit for the last couple of decades on regional food planning, and is now working on regional food planning with the Department of City Planning. So without further ado, Matt.
Thank you very much, Nevin, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Rosita, could you advance to the next slide, please? And then the next slide after that. Thank you. So some of you may be asking yourselves what role the city government has in regionalism. And for much of the city's history, we haven't had an explicit focus on the region. And our office itself came about 4 years ago out of a recommendation from the city's strategic plan, 1NYC, recognizing that so much of what makes the city prosper and thrive, both now and continue to be equitable and sustainable in the future, depends on thinking outside of our borders, depends on thinking regionally. And next slide, please. And as part of that, we were formed in the Department of City Planning to think long-term, to have some sort of an understanding, both from a data and analytics perspective, but also from a more planning perspective, to instill regionalism into what the city is doing. So some of what our office does, and we're a group of 4 people, is take what data is currently available and try and understand the larger perspective of our region, and then use that as a fact basis to inform long-term strategic planning, whether that is something that the Department of City Planning is doing itself, other city agencies are doing, or as we find ourselves increasingly going throughout the region to talk to other stakeholders and bring them together to form collaborative plans. Next slide, please. When we talk about the region, what we define the region, we borrow from the Regional Plan Association, which has been since the 1920s, understanding our metropolitan region as 31 counties, 3 states, and now 700 municipalities. And under their long-term vision, understanding how we can all work better together. So when I talk about the region, we usually talk about 22.6 million people, 37% of which are New York City, and over 8 million homes. Next slide, please. And in terms of jobs, it's nearly 10% of US GDP. And if you didn't already know where New York City was on this map on the left, you wouldn't easily be able to pick it out. We have all sorts of office and institutional jobs, industrial jobs, and local services jobs located along the Northeast Corridor, stretching from New Jersey up to Connecticut, all throughout Long Island, up into the Hudson Valley, and of course, right here in the city. Now, what does a regional perspective, we've heard from our last two speakers, what that means for food. From the city's perspective, we're growing. We're reaching nearly 9 million people. It's projected by 2040. And recent studies suggest that our food demand is growing at about 1.6% a year, which is twice the national average. So we recognize from the city's perspective that a growing city needs to think more regionally in sourcing its food, both now and in the future. Next slide. And so as of today, we estimate about 19 billion pounds of food are distributed each year throughout the city, 42,000 separate point of sale outlets. And what gets that food to that last mile is an incredibly complex, intricate system that involves thousands and thousands of farmers, both here in the region, but also throughout the country, and truly it's a global system. But we don't have a great understanding of how much of the city's food supply is coming from the region today. Next slide, please. So when starting to understand and measure a scale of what food can be in the region, we're adopting a slightly different understanding of what that could mean. We just heard from Kate say that the Northeast, that the Northeast food shed truly is a group of overlapping urban food sheds from Boston down to New York, down to Philly, down to DC. But we also know that from procurement, sometimes regional means New York State. Sometimes it means New York State and all of the adjoining states. And then sometimes regional might also mean what's practically able to get here. So as a basis for starting to understand regional food, we thought to ourselves, if food is trying to get into Hunts Point, for example, the produce market in the Bronx, and meat and fish market in the Bronx, how can it get there? And so the map on the right, which is not meant to be actual, is meant to be illustrative, has two overlapping spheres. One is three hours from Hunts Point, the other is 6 hours from Hunts Point. And using that as just a basis to start to understand, what do we mean when we say regional? And we know that also because regional depends on your perspective in the food system, it can change depending on whether you're a farmer that is producing mostly for farmers markets. And so your definition of regional might mean 100 miles going to the city. But if you're a larger farm that is producing for grocery stores, regional to you might mean all of the Northeast. And similarly, if you are a small distributor located somewhere in the Hudson Valley, your understanding of what regional is often dependent on your personal networks. It's often dependent on what's in season when. And increasingly, because of climate change, this is all changing. The next slide, please. But what we do know, thanks to the USDA, is a broad understanding of farms and where they're located. Now, the USDA every 5 years, for those who are not aware, creates a census of agriculture. The most recent one was released recently, but it was collected in 2017. And the data gives us a broad understanding of the producer side of the food system. And so this is brought from some data from the USDA that gives us an understanding of how land is being used both for human development and also for cultivation. And matching that data with county level farm data, we can be able to understand what kinds of food are grown where, and using this databases, we can start to figure out, all right, where can we, in the Northeast and in our region, be able to source more of our food regionally. Next slide. And so we're just starting the beginning of this work, but this is to give you a sense, some of the clusters of food production in our region within a 3-hour radius. We have all sorts of vegetable cultivation happening in the Hudson Valley, and dairy cultivation happening and dairy in the Hudson Valley. But within a 3-hour radius, some of the most intense cultivation of land is happening in New Jersey. It's happening in Pennsylvania. And so when we think about regional food sourcing, some of the questions that come up is how much should we be sourcing from New York State, upstate, versus other states. And as we continue to delve into what's available and be able to understand where we can take our regional food system, all sorts of interesting questions come up. And we're just at the beginning of understanding what's possible here. And so I look forward to the questions folks who are listening in might be having, and this discussion with other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. And as Matt just said, please feel free to send us your questions on the chat feature. I'd like to now turn to our final speaker, Kate Fulham. And Kate comes to us from the East End Food Institute in a part of the region that has, for a long time, contributed a substantial amount to our food system through commodity agriculture, more recently through different sorts of agriculture, viticulture in particular. Kate built her career at the Group for the East End, Southampton Hospital, and most recently at the ALDA Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. And she brings to us substantial experience about agriculture in our region and also the unique issues facing us in parts of our region like Long Island. So welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Nevin. Thanks everyone for being here. As you said, I have a background that is varied, and I love to think of myself as a jack of all trades in terms of looking at the food system regionally. Our focus at East End Food Institute is to support, promote, and advocate for local food and local producers, but we certainly participate with other partners in order to see this as a regional approach. And one of the ways that we're really excited to do that is by working with CUNY on the regional food equity plan. You can go to the next slide, Rosita. So just to give everybody a little bit of perspective in terms of geography, some people don't know even where the East End of Long Island is, or what is, in our name, East End Food Institute. We actually are about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on traffic, from New York City, further out east. There are about, in Suffolk County, which is kind of the area circled approximately, there's about 600 farms, and 2/3 of those farms are operating on under 50 acres of land. That has a lot to do with the density of population out in our area. We have had good measures with partners at the county, federal, state, and nonprofit local level to preserve land. But a lot of those tracts are smaller and are, higher density production. Just to give you an idea from the agricultural census that Matt was mentioning, our region in 2017 produced just under $240 million worth of agricultural commodities. So there is a lot of variation, not only viticulture as indicated on the map, but mixed vegetable production, some dairy like cheeses. We have hops farms now with breweries that are doing value added. And we also have a lot of oyster growers and fishermen in our region that are producing and adding to the economy. What I've seen just in the past 2 years of being at East End Food Institute is that there's a large population of younger people that are starting farms on smaller tracts with our partners at the Peconic Land Trust that are working to lease 1 acre and 5 acre parcels to these people. And so I'm interested to see how those numbers change in the next agricultural census. But just to give you an idea of where we are, you could see East End Food Institute. We're in Southampton on the South Fork of Long Island. We actually have a commercial kitchen at the Stony Brook University Southampton campus. And so you could go to the next slide and you'll get an image from our commercial kitchen. So we actually, we occupy this space not only as a growing food hub, but as a shared kitchen for local food businesses to produce their products. We believe that part of a sustainable and equitable food system is a healthy economy. So by supporting these small scale food producers, we're able to, maximize the infrastructure that we have at the kitchen, but also help to share the load and have small scale food businesses that are turning produce into products that can help support not only their business, but local farms. And that contributes to creating a lot of jobs in our area. We also had completed in 2015 a food hub feasibility study with funding from the USDA Local Food Promotion Program. That's through the Agricultural Marketing Service. And there was identified a need for food aggregation because of all those small farms don't have the volume that is needed, but combined they may to serve wholesale markets. Processing, which we are doing, not only creating products for farms to sell back on their shelves, but also to open wholesale markets, which I'll talk about later, and also distribution. And we're seeing that crunch right now with the COVID-19 crisis. As Nevin was saying earlier, oftentimes in a crisis, the areas where you anticipate that you would have issues are highlighted, and distribution is one of those major areas. So that's something that we're working on to leverage existing distribution systems to get food out into areas within our community that's needed. And we're hoping to leverage some software for that as well. We're a small nonprofit. We have 7 staff, 4 full-time and 3 part-time. So really happy to be working with partners like our panelists today and others that we might reach out to. So you can go to the next slide. Our second point, we really believe that having a healthy environment is key to having an equitable and sustainable local food system. We need to combat climate change by trying to be efficient about the ways in which we distribute food, not only localizing distribution, but streamlining distribution so that there's not 5 trucks on the road, but maybe 1 that's taking more of a load. So that's where we're hoping to leverage our commercial kitchen as a food hub to aggregate product. We also see that, over the years, not only is preserving land important to sustaining agriculture in our region, but it does provide groundwater recharge as well as land stewardship and animal habitat. So essentially we're, just want to highlight that it's really important to take care of our environment as well and keep that in perspective. So we can go to the next slide. In terms of equity, our major push is our Farm to Community program. As part of the 2015 Food Hub feasibility study, the study recommended that we try to leverage surplus produce in order to open up different wholesale markets for farms. And so in 2018, we got a grant from a community foundation to buy a vacuum seal machine and start to minimally process surplus produce and vacuum seal that to give that directly to the food pantry and work with Long Island Cares, one of the food banks on Long Island, for higher volume when we had thousands of pounds of produce to be able to process. So we're looking at that model to expand that by using the same preparation techniques, but selling to hospitals and schools to help more local food get on the menu, aggregate from multiple sources in our region, and then potentially also serve points further west. We really believe that it's important for everyone to be able to access local food and regional food. So we're trying to create systems where people that can afford to pay the true cost of growing food, especially in our region where the cost of living and land is very high, are able to do that, but that the proceeds of that trickle down into institutional pricing as well as direct donation for those community members in need. I think, one of the key areas in our region in terms of equity is definitely related to racial equity. We have a large Hispanic population on the eastern end of Long Island, and one of the ways that we are trying to address that was working with nutrition education organizations like Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County to do bilingual education and recipes for these frozen items that you see on the slide on the right that are being given out in the food pantries. But definitely looking forward to learning more from our panelists and from everyone who is, in our discussion today, so that we can, on our smaller level locally, make a regional impact. So thanks for having me here today.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody and say how grateful I am. And this is echoing a comment that Nick Freudenberg, my colleague, posted to the chat board, that we're able to have this discussion and converse during this terrible epidemic, and that we're able to work together so closely, if not in person, but via Zoom. So thanks, everybody. I'd like to open this up to a Q&A, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions to start us off, and then hopefully integrate questions from the audience. One of the questions that comes to mind as we talk about regional food planning is the need for various stakeholders to be involved in planning. And I'd like to ask the panelists, what evidence, what data is really critical, and what constituencies are really critical to develop an equitable long-term plan for the food system? Does anyone like to start us off by volunteering, or I could maybe I'll call on somebody. Kolu, would you like to start us off? What do we need to actually bring people together into a food planning process that can sometimes seem really technocratic and distant to many stakeholders?
So thanks for that question. I mean, to start with, we need to know who the farmers of color are in New York State, and that's inclusive. We can't forget. One of the comments was, what about urban agriculture? Urban agriculture is very important, and especially in a time like now, when food supply chains may be breaking down, having some local supply can really make a difference for people. But that data, is we're just in the process of collecting that data about. I think the New York State farmers. And at the community level, I mean, one of the things about resiliency is having more of a distributed network of decisions being made at the smallest level, at the most local level as possible. So that means that there has to be community inclusion across the board. And there are many structures for that. The thing is that people don't always feel that those structures are created for them, for their voices, for their lived experience. So we have community boards, we have tenants associations. I'm wondering now about the mobilization, around COVID, where is the discussion of the fact that we have Black associations and tenants associations, and they can be part of sort of the infrastructure for emergency response. So I think in terms of planning, we have this infrastructure, it needs to be activated in a way that people feel like it's really going to make a difference for their needs, instead of a top-down agenda that's driven by the highest and best use, principles that are basically around profit. And I think that most people know that. That's how priorities have been set. And there needs to be really clear messaging that, we're trying to have a values-based decision process that, will be inclusive of that must be inclusive of your voice.
Thanks. Kate, I want to turn to you. Kate Fulham, thanks. What are the mechanisms to sort of integrate key constituencies into the planning process? On Long Island, I know that over decades, there's been a great debate about affordable housing construction, and a difference between low-income communities of color in Long Island and more affluent communities over an issue like housing, which everybody agrees is really important for everyone. So how can we make sure that constituencies that haven't had a voice are really part of a regional food planning process?
Well, I mean, I think I'll just acknowledge that this whole planning process is very daunting, but what I see hope in is the recent conversations that I've been having with Nick Freudenberg and his team to sort of take the 50,000-foot view and start to zoom in on different sections of that. And what we're going to be doing is identifying in each of those zoomed in sections who needs to have a voice, and bring those people together, whether virtually or in person, to share on the different topics or different issues that are identified. So what I am really encouraged by is this New York Community Trust funded research project that will allow people that can segment their brain into these sections to study this and to give a directive to different segments of organizations or coalitions or populations that can take action in very specific ways that are coordinated on a bigger level. Mm-hmm. I think just to comment on the economic inequities on Eastern Long Island, we are seeing that very strongly right now with the COVID epidemic. And one of the ways we're seeing it is that it also illustrates the regional approach of the connection of Eastern Long Island to New York City, because a lot of people from New York City have left that area and come out to their second homes or to a rental property on the east end of Long Island to sort of shelter in place here. And what's happening is that there's a very high demand right now for those who could afford it to get home delivery or picking up local farm stand vegetables, whatever's left right now at the end of the winter season. And then with the schools closing, there's left with a population that is severely at the other end of the spectrum in need of food. And so we're seeing that economic disparity very clearly right now. And in a time that's usually a little bit quieter in our area, I'm seeing a lot of pockets of individuals that are either working by themselves or working with very small groups to activate. And now in this, in this week, I'm seeing those individual pockets starting to come together with other people as coalitions. The irony is that for us at East End Food Institute, if our vision for distribution and a food hub, et cetera, was in effect right now, probably things would be a lot easier. So we're just a little bit, behind that, as you stated earlier in the introduction. But those are some of the thoughts I'm having right now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And building on that and reflecting some of the discussion in the discussion board, I want to ask, in this current crisis, people are focused front and center on issues of immediate food access. And this is a problem in planning that has been in existence forever. How do we move from sort of crisis reaction to long-term planning, and how do we engage constituencies who are really legitimately in need of addressing immediate concerns of hunger and malnourishment into a process that is really aimed at the long term? And maybe I can turn to you, Matt, because you're working in a department that addresses very short-term issues of rezoning and long-term planning issues. How do you see the tension between the long-term and the short-term needs?
Yeah, thank you, Nevin. I think that the short term can be an opportunity to set into place some processes that we can then, in the longer term, after this crisis is behind us, plan for a more resilient system. And I think I noted this a little bit earlier, but if I didn't, climate change is going to be creating more frequent disruptions in food supply specifically, but in our life in New York City and across the country more generally. We know this, and so having a crisis like this, there are of course myriad challenges that need to be addressed on a day-by-day and hour-by-hour basis, but we can also use this as a catalyst, in a sense, to build in some more equitable processes in the long term. And I wanted to highlight something that Department of City Planning has been working with over the last few years, which is our FRESH program, which has been used to identify areas of New York City where there is food insecurity concentrated, where there is a food desert, and build into the city's zoning code opportunities for people to have upgrades for refrigeration, for parking waivers, for some really wonky stuff in the building and development process, but then results in, so far we've had about 45 different approved grocery stores throughout the city as a result of this program, more than 800,000 square feet of grocery space. And so it's been off to a slow start, partly because there's a lag between the approval of these projects and when they're actually built. But I think this is a good example of something where you can build into the processes that the city has and continue to think long term while also building something. And I'll note that both Baltimore and Philly have then built out similar programs based on what we've did. So there is a matter of course, cities learn from each other and borrow policies, and food is certainly a place, thanks to the work that the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact has done in highlighting what is working in different cities globally. And we can then use some of those as case studies to inform what our own region, our own city can do.
Thanks, Matt. And while I move to the next question, we also want to just give you another poll, a quick poll, just to find out within the audience, what is your role in food planning? So it's a quick multiple choice poll. Rosita, if you could. So we want to just see what aspect of food planning are you currently involved in, or would you like to play a role in? And you can choose more than one of these roles. The question I want to move on to, and we'll get to the results in a second, is about measuring racial equity. We've talked a lot about the importance of addressing race, gender, class disparities in the food system. And I think it was Kolo who mentioned the MSU annotated bibliography on measures of racial equity and food justice in the food system. I just want to know what you think about ways to really know whether we're moving in the right direction in terms of eliminating injustices and increasing food equity. And Kate Clancy, you haven't gone yet, but I'm opening this up to all four of our panelists. You'd like to jump in.
I could say a few things based on the ESNI work that we've done for years that is a great deal related to equity in low-income neighborhoods throughout the Northeast. We've learned a lot in the last 5 or 6 years from a lot of very important kind of digging deeper research that's been done on access to food. We know a lot more in particular areas of the country and specific cities and in other places about how people make food choices, how low-income folks make food choices. It turns out they're not that much different from the choices that people who are not low-income make. We've learned that putting supermarkets into an area does not necessarily, it increases access, but it doesn't necessarily change what people are purchasing. And there are a lot of studies around the country that are showing that. What we've learned is that there is a great deal that groups can do, but they have to have reasonable expectations about what all of the work that people are doing around food access for low-income and low-income folks and people of color who are low-income is not where we'd like to get, because there are so many other factors, including general education level, that have such a large role to play in people making good, affordable choices for their families. So I'll just throw that out there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Would anyone else like to come? Yes, Kate.
Well, I'll add to that in terms of what we measure to know if a system is racially equitable, in terms of gender as well. That it's important to think. I think we're kind of programmed to think about food equity and food justice in terms of access to affordable, healthy, culturally relevant food, and that is critical, especially now. But we also, need to think about measures that will show us about ownership within the food system, and access not only to food but to land. So who owns the means of production within the food system? And a lot of that is under the radar. I mean, I know in my community in Central Harlem, there is a whole network of people who own home-based catering businesses who actually distribute food in shopping carts and go door to door to some small business, other small businesses, and deliver meals that way. And of course we know that there's a lack of access to credit, et cetera. So the ownership is the second area. A third area in terms of measuring food equity is in decision making. We know that nationally, food policy councils and other bodies that are supposed to reflect citizen involvement tend to be predominantly white, tend to be, sort of more, people who have higher levels of educational attainment, et cetera. And so measuring, sort of representation and decision-making and governance is also very critical.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. There's been some chat comments about food waste. And while I don't want to ask a question specifically about food waste, it does raise the question that I wanted to ask, which is, how do we make sure that different aspects of the food system are integrated into a regional food plan? Because we tend to work in silos in our personal lives as well as in the food system world. So food waste is a critical issue, and it's connected to climate change, it's connected to waste management, and it's also connected to how we manage our food resources. But the question is really more broad, and how do we make sure that as we move forward with the regional plan, that we integrate different aspects of the food system, and also, and there's been some chat comments about this as well, how do we integrate existing plans that have been developed over the past decade or so into our food planning thinking, or do we have to reinvent the wheel? So I'll throw that out there too. Before we do though, Rosita says we have results on our poll, and it seems like about half of you are involved in actually planning within your organizations or companies, which is very interesting. And many advocates and many of you on this forum who are interested in becoming involved as involved citizens. And so in the coming weeks and months, we hope to reach out to you to help integrate your interests and work and expertise into the food planning processes that we're going to be engaged in. Thanks.
Nevin, I could probably say a few words on this and how we make sure that the planning, I think you were getting at, is that the planning process is a bit more comprehensive, includes stakeholders throughout the region, and we're not reinventing the wheel. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. This is, in a sense, the bread and butter of what we view our team's role to be, and how we go about that is trying to strengthen relationships between what the city's doing and what other governments and other nonprofit stakeholders are doing throughout the region, and look for places of synergy. And so one thing we've done, not explicitly on food, is think about ways of regionalizing the city's IDNYC program. So for those of you who don't know, the IDNYC program is the New York City's municipal ID. You can get the ID regardless of citizenship or any other sort of national legal status, so long as you claim to be a resident of New York City. And as part of the ID program, you can also receive benefits and discounts to local museums and other cultural and tourist attractions throughout the city. Something we did was work together with folks upstate and also in Long Island to create benefits for New York City residents who wish to be upstate and access those opportunities. And part of how this could look in food is simply bringing people together where they wouldn't already. So we know, for example, food hub feasibility studies that have happened in Long Island, have happened in the Hudson Valley, have occurred recently also in New Jersey. How can we bring together food stakeholders from the city out into New Jersey or Long Island or upstate and have a conversation about how we build on the findings of those reports, so that we are connecting dots where they might not already be connected. And another way that we are currently doing that is through making as much data as possible to inform local constituencies in their own planning efforts. So we have at newyorkcity.gov/region, we have our Metro Region Explorer, which is a data visualization tool to look at all types of economic data. And hopefully, if we're able to build out a data understanding of food a little bit better, we can display that data as well, share it open source, and help local planners to be able to arm these constituencies with information about their localities to inform local planning processes. So I think it's not just across different aspects of the food supply chain itself, but across spatial dynamics and geographies as well. The city having a better relationship with where its food comes from, not just in terms of stakeholders, but understanding how we can be able to, for example, prepare city procurement contracts so that upstate farmers are ready for those, and that they're informing, that these contracts are informing what the concerns and challenges that are facing those in the farming community. How do we take into account concerns of growers, and so we're not inadvertently favoring some types of farmers or some types of distributors over others? I think that each of this is important, but it all sort of comes together with simply getting people in a room, or in the short term virtually, and sharing with each other. That's the heart of most planning work.
And
Thanks,
I might.
Kate Fulham raised her hand first, so I'll turn to you, Kate Clancy, right after that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to reference also just the need for combining forces with a regional food plan related to funding. For us, we applied to the USDA as with an implementation grant to implement the recommendations of the Food Hub feasibility study that we had done. But there were some, heavy hitters that won out in New York, because we're a pretty small nonprofit organization. But I think if there's a role for CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, it would be to not only make recommendations, but then also potentially help to combine funding resources so that projects that are going to improve distribution, equity, et cetera, can move forward, because oftentimes that work does get subbed out to smaller localized efforts like nonprofit organizations.
Thank you. And Kate Clancy, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to mention, like I said earlier, that there is a lot of unfamiliarity with how regions operate, how to do work at a regional level. Most people are lots more familiar with how to do it at a local level than with the regional level. And there is also, when you're talking about the plan that needs to engage as many different sectors as possible, I mean, that's a multi-sector exercise. It's also an interdisciplinary exercise, if I could use a jargon word from education world. But the fact is that there are incredibly good materials out there to do some, informal continuing education for everybody on how to work across sectors, how to work across political boundaries, what kinds of challenges people are going to run into, how to deal with those. And also there's a lot of really good material, I'm sure as many people know, but maybe haven't gone back to look at it in a while, of how to define food systems in all the parts, not just the supply chain, but all the other components, and to use those graphics about what is a full food system to choose which area it's going to be most useful for them to work on, and then have an overriding group of people who know how to combine and meld the material that people are going to be working on in somewhat separate sectors, because you really have to do that with a systems brain in action.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one last poll, actually, that addresses the issue that's on the front of people's minds right now, COVID-19 and its impact on both short-term and long-term planning. So I wonder, Rosita, if you could post the poll?
Yes, coming up.
And this is phrased as a will it or won't it question, but I really want to have the panelists share their thoughts on how will and what will be required if this terrible pandemic is to affect the long-term food systems planning for the region. I don't know if you have the results to share yet, Rosita. But...
Yes, I can share. We have a very strong opinion right here.
So my question, apart from recognizing that this this pandemic has caused us to reassess a lot of aspects of our lives, and the recession that is likely to occur as a result of the pandemic will have other long-term impacts. I guess the question is more about how might we learn from this experience in terms of how we structure food systems planning for our region. And I don't know if any of the panelists would like to start us off.
I will, let me make a few comments. You know, we found out that, and a lot of us in the public health community have known for years that many cities and areas have gone through emergency preparedness operations for exactly public health epidemics. In many cases, those plans have not been able to be put into effect because of a lack of materials, a lack of preparation, you know, a lack of all the things that we've been hearing about. And we're in a part of the terrible mess we're in is because of that. So I think that what we're trying to do in terms of long-term planning for food for a region is to go through some of those, quote, preparedness exercises over the long term, not just for emergencies, but for more frequent public health epidemics, more frequent quarantines, etc. I think that we have a lot to learn from the people on the ground in public health who have already done that, who know how to do that kind of thinking. And I think we should merge that with a lot of the thinking we already understand about how to work as a region on food issues.
You're muted.
Would any of the other panelists like to add or
I would just add that I think all of this just underscores how connected we all are as a region and how dependent we are. We like to think of New York as a truly global city, and it is, and it benefits from a truly global food system. But I think that this particular moment we find ourselves in, it emphasizes how dependent we are on things such as fundamental as food that often we do take for granted. And so I think we're learning a lot about the systems we rely on, whether that's transportation, whether that's the food distribution that gets food from hubs in the city to our grocery stores. And we're learning, I think, both how resilient those are to shocks and how food may run out when we go one day, but the next day it's back. But I think long term, the challenge for us is, and I saw this as one of the comments, and I completely agree, using this as an opportunity to talk about how we can put together a more resilient system from the ground up, and using crisis as an opportunity to catalyze new change. And I do think that is happening in many places, and looking forward to seeing how our city can come back even more resilient in the months and years to come.
Yeah, I wanted to also comment just that we're seeing sort of the rug being pulled out from all of the people working in the food system, with restaurants closing down, small food businesses, just shuttering their doors due to lack of capacity to serve the needs, or staff getting sick. I really think it's important that we make sure to provide some relief to these people that are in the middle, because there's also a significant pressure right now on community members in need. And if we don't take care of the middle, also, those people are just going to become community members in need. So that's kind of the area that we're focusing on right now in our area with East End Food Institute, is just to help these small food businesses, farmers, restaurateurs survive by engaging our network to connect them with who has resources, who needs resources, how can they work together.
Nicole, I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I'll add another note. I guess the situation right now is making us aware. Again, I'll go back to what I said in the beginning, the most vulnerable. We can design systems that really center those who will be most vulnerable in the case of an emergency, whether it's because they live close, they live in a floodplain, or they're low income, or they're at the top of a NYCHA building, and if the power goes out, that's got to be the starting point for planning. And that obviously crises are going to come in many different shapes and forms, and so we can't plan only for a certain type of crisis. This crisis is emergency food providers are not we can't be in contact with one another, which is incredibly difficult. So the very places that people go to get food are shut down because they don't want to be spreading the virus. So I don't know the answer to that. I just know that two things. One, we need to begin really creating systemic ways to subsidize food. Food is an essential, right? We cannot live without it. And so that means that in the most income unequal state in the country, New York State, we have the highest degree of income inequality. We need to be in the lead of finding ways to ensure that profit and the market is not the only way that food gets distributed. And it doesn't have to only be charity as well. I always think we have to bring in the private sector. Why not have insurance companies? We have so many people who have nutrition-related disease. Wouldn't it lower the cost of insurance if those people had subsidized, guaranteed access to healthy food? I mean, we've got to think creatively about different ways of making food affordable in normal times and free in times of emergency. And then secondly, again, centering those that are most vulnerable in the planning process, not just in terms of their voice being at the table, but as a principle, through which we make decisions.
Thank you very much. And we've actually reached our end of the time frame for our forum. Rosita, do you have those poll results? Can you show those? We want to continue this dialogue very much. Obviously, members of the audience strongly agree that we need new approaches to food systems planning. And echoing Kolo, we need creative ways to think about addressing inequities in our food system. This session was really the beginning of what we intend to be a long and comprehensive process to engage each of us in the effort to craft a regional food vision and plan for this region. And I really appreciate your contributions over Zoom. I appreciate the audience's bearing with us as we try out this new technology to keep us connected during a period in which we need to be apart from each other physically. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you, and we will do our best to quickly post the forum in its entirety for your colleagues who want to view it. Rosita just posted our contact information to be in touch. There were many comments in the chat that we didn't really get to, and unfortunately, because of the technology and our testing it out, we didn't allow for audience question and answer the way we normally do in our forums, but we will try to find a way to communicate with audience members about the issues that were raised in the chat. So thank you again, everybody. Please stay healthy and bear with the crisis that we're in as well as possible. And I hope that the next time we have a chance to gather around this issue, we're able to gather in person. Thanks so much. Rosita, any?
Just one last mini poll. Again, as Nevin mentioned, we are so grateful that all of you made the time, particularly grateful to our speakers amidst this uncertain and tumultuous time to join us and share their insight and incredible wisdom on this complex topic. And as Nevin mentioned at the beginning, we are hoping that this is just the start of a series of events where we can dig even deeper and continue these conversations. So thank you also everyone who joined us from New York, from around the country, and even overseas. We really appreciate you being part of this conversation. And we'll be posting follow-up information and the video recording as soon as available. And again, thank you so much. And as this is an experiment, we have one last question for you on the forum format. So bear with us. I will just pull it up. What do you think about this virtual forum experiment, as we might need to test it out again for at least one more month.
And Nick reminded us that in our newsletter, we'll invite people to join us in the citywide survey of food availability over the epidemic. And look for that in the newsletter. If you don't subscribe to the newsletter, send us an email or go to our website and you can subscribe and be part of the conversation. So this is the last question. If you could please answer. Do you want to show the audience the results?
Yes. Give me a second. Technology. Okay, and following. All right, so we have 72% thinking that they prefer online, or they don't think that there is a much bigger difference between online and in person. Thank you.
Very interesting. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon, and be well, everybody.